Hi everybody, it's Allie Hanley with First Chapters, and this week's book is The Electric Heir by Victoria Lee. And this is a sequel to a book she wrote called The Fever King, and it kind of comes with a disclaimer. But basically it's just because one of the characters is gay or curious or something like that. So not a big deal. It's a pretty thick book. And you probably found this video because you read the first one. So maybe this is a fun little preview before you buy the new one. Oh, by the way, it says it's on sale March 17th, and now it's May, so you could already buy this in the store or online. I'll leave a link to that to buy it on Amazon in the pinned comment on the video. And let's go ahead and get started with the first chapter. So I'm just now cracking the book. Let's see. Got some diagrams in the beginning of Durham, which is probably North Carolina, South Carolina, North Carolina, I forget. This book contains content that might be disturbing to some readers. For more details, please see the content notes on the back of the book. We'll just skip that part. Let's get to it. Kind of starts out with a little, like a message that was received. I'm going to skip that part. It's like the commentary of a transmission. I'm just going to get right to the first chapter. It took me a while, huh? Okay, chapter 1, Noam. The trees grew dense and close together in the quarantine zone, magic humming through their branches and stretching in their roots beneath soil and snow. At dusk, everything was shadow, shifting shapes merging and diverging on the forest floor, near impossible to tell which were human and which were tricks of the light. Magic shivered through the ambient air. Noam felt it like a physical thing all around him, connected to his own power somehow, the virus infecting everything it touched. It crystallized on his breath and prickled his skin like static. The target hid behind that copse of trees at Noam's 4 o'clock. Electromagnetism eddied and tugged around him the same way it did everything else, betraying his location. Noam sensed the iron in the target's veins, his magic a silvery glimmer that nearly bled into the snow. It would be tempting to think that this was an easy kill, but Noam knew better. This target was strong. He'd drawn Noam's blood twice already, still sticky on Noam's face, although the cuts were healed. But he couldn't wait forever. Noam counted his heartbeats and closed his eyes, feeling along the wires of that electromagnetic tension and looping it like fabric around the target's body. He heard the whomp of weight hitting the ground, air displaced from lungs. That didn't last long. A burst of energy, plasma-like, exploded through the trees, cutting through branches and trunks. Noam pulled up a defensive shield just in time, twisting gravity and magnetism as he deflected the magic away to crackle like fire through the dead wood overhead. Which, exposed his position. Noam stepped out from behind his tree and sent lightning across the space between him and the target, who huddled in wet snow with sweat turning to frost on his hair. The bolt made contact. Finally. Noam wasn't tired, but he certainly was cold. Better to end this quickly. He pushed harder, another burst of force behind the lightning, drawing as much as he could from static and electromagnetism. The target was deflecting some of Noam's magic, but not all. He dropped to his knees with a grunt, body shaking with the effort of holding Noam off. The man was almost out of energy. Noam could tell. A little longer and Noam would exhaust the last of his resources, have him seizing on the ground as chaotic electrical impulses swarmed his brain. Then he'd die. Just not yet. Noam moved closer, ice crunching beneath his boots and magic swarming round his ankles like white water. The vessels had burst in the target's eyes. Whites shot through with red, mouth slack, and drool smearing his chin. His muscles twitched uncontrollably as their nerves misfired, thousands of volts searing through his brain. When he lost balance, crumpling onto his side, when Noam felt his magic falter, that was when Noam would let go. In the absence of power, the forest was silent. The animals had fled. All that was left were the sound of tree branches cracking in the ice and fire, and the heavy, arrhythmic gasps of the target struggling to breathe. No, not breathe. Speak. Noam moved closer, but he kept one hand on the butt of his gun and his power near, just in case. The target fumbled over his own tongue, gargling on spit. With veins bulging out of his neck, he looked like a caricature of himself. Noam crunched in the snow at his side. I know this isn't the only lab left. Where are the rest? The target made a convulsive movement. It took Noam a second to realize he was shaking his head. No, you listen. He could barely move, but he managed to grab the leg of Noam's pants anyway. Noam drew his gun quicker than humanly possible, his magic doing half the work, pointing the barrel at the man's head as he clicked off the safety. Take your hand off me. The man let go, but Noam kept the gun where it was. Answer the question. You can't trust him. A garbled noise, and the man spat out a mouthful of blood. Then, Lair, don't trust him. Noam tapped the gun against the man's temple. Thanks for the advice. Now tell me about the labs. The man pressed his lips together hard enough. The skin blanched around his mouth. He glared at Noam with all the heat he could muster, which wasn't much at this juncture. Fuck it, Noam thought. He was going to have to start yanking out fingernails, which was fucking disgusting. Saddeningly, the color drained from the target's face. Noam didn't need telepathy to feel the man's terror. It bled out of him like a sickness, and he didn't need to turn around to know why. But he did anyway, twisting to track the target's red gaze as Lair stepped out from between the trees. He was tall, nearly blending in with their shadows, a specter dressed in black. Their gazes met. Lair gestured with one gloved hand. Let me finish this, Noam. Noam got to his feet and made room. Lair knelt at the man's side. There was something gentle about the way Lair rested his fingers along the curve of the man's neck, thumb skirting the windpipe. He could have been human, almost, if it weren't for the strange, colorless eyes and the fact there was nothing behind them. What is your name? Lair said. The man stared at him and didn't speak, trembling visibly under Lair's touch. Of course the target was afraid. How could he have predicted that Lair would come into the quarantine zone and do his own dirty work? Noam holstered his weapon and clasped his hands behind his back, watching and feeling nothing, not even when Lair smiled, the expression thin and sickly insincere on his face. Your name, Lair said again. Michael? Michael, why don't you tell us where the other labs are? The sounds Michael made were pathetic, wet, snuffly noises like a wounded animal. Lair's thumb rubbed against his skin, a soothing motion. Noam wondered if Michael felt Lair's presence in his mind, the same way Noam had, like a shadow version of himself tingling its fingers up in the threads of his thoughts, twisting and braiding them into new patterns. Or maybe that was the wrong metaphor. Stain, Noam thought. Lair's persuasion left a stain. At least Michael wouldn't be unclean for much longer. Noam saw it in Michael's eyes the moment his will snapped. The humiliation and self-loathing Michael felt when he opened his mouth and the information spilled out like sea bursting past stone. When it was finished, when Michael was finally left wordless and sobbing in the snow, Lair unfolded back to his full height and looked at Noam. He didn't have to say anything. Still, Noam waited until Lair had stepped out of spatter range to draw his gun again and pull the trigger. He hit the target right in the skull, a clean kill shot that sent blood and brain matter bursting out across the white ground like a brilliant red star. For a moment, Noam was reminded of Brenham, the scarlet mess on the wall behind his desk. The first kill was half a year ago now, long enough that Noam had started to forget the details. Had Brennan's tie been gray or blue? Had Noam been able to smell the gunpowder? The memory was like water in cupped hands. Lair waited 10 feet away, already impatient by the time Noam holstered his gun. "Get the samples," Lair reminded him. The samples were in the satchel the target had looped over his head and shoulder, a black leather construction pinned beneath dead weight. Noam had to push the corpse out of the way, rolling him over to lie face down in the snow while Noam tugged the bag strap over the ruined skull and slung it over his own shoulder instead. He checked its contents just to be safe. There were 6 vials of blood swarming with the virus, two of its milky vaccine. Noam pulled a vial free and turned it over in his palm, the thick fluid contents slipping along the glass walls. Was that really all it would take? Just a few centiliters of this strange substance would protect someone from the same death that had killed Noam's father? One injection could take down even the strongest witching. Noam, he startled badly enough he almost dropped the satchel and its precious contents. Telekinesis caught the vaccine vial before it could hit the ground. "Shit, sorry." Lair's gaze was sharp when Noam looked up again. "Be more careful. Let's go." Noam tucked the vaccine back into its case and zipped up the satchel, clutching the protective hand around the strap. He fell into step beside Lair, who was checking his watch with a frown on his face, probably already late for some meeting or another. Ever since his election as chancellor, Lair had been busier than ever. Noam was surprised he found the time to sleep. After a few steps, Lair held out one hand, palm up. Of course, he didn't trust Noam. Not even now. Not even with horrific thing Noam had done to prove his loyalty. Noam passed Lair the bag. His frozen fingers ached when he let go. "We'll deal with the next lab this weekend," Lair said once they reached the ancient car they'd requisitioned, parked in an abandoned lot a mile from where they'd killed Michael. Not driverless. Lair didn't want anything with GPS, anything that might raise questions when the car went for maintenance and they didn't realize Noam had falsified location records. They were supposed to be just 5 miles outside the Carolinian border, where the worst magic one might encounter was a 2-headed rabbit or a nomadic tree, not 50 miles. Lair opened the passenger side door and held it there for Noam to duck under his arm and slide onto the leather seat, then pushed it shut. "I'm okay," Noam told himself. "I'm in control. I'm in control." Noam sat in the silent interior of the car, shivering in the cold and watching Lair walk around the front to the driver's side. Only when Lair had opened the door and sat down did Noam use magic to start the engine. Lair gave him a sidelong, approving glance, then pulled the shifter into gear and started them off down the decaying road back to Carolina. I'm working Saturday," Noam told him. "Then we'll go on Sunday." Noam tilted his head away, brow pressed against the cold window. The gray landscape rolled past, bare trees and bombed-out shells of old buildings. Lair seemed to hit every single pothole, the chassis of the car jolting each time and jarring Noam against his seat. You seem to have taken a liking to that Beretta. Noam glanced back at Lair, who flicked his gaze down toward the gun holstered at Noam's hip. Noam's fingers skipped down to graze the textured grip. I'm glad. Lair went on, smiling slightly before he looked back toward the road. There's a reason I chose this model for you last year. It's the perfect size and weight for your hand. Noam curled that hand into a fist. What did you do with the original one? Disposed of it, don't worry. I told you they'd never trace that gun back to you. The Brennan case is closed. Right. No one cared about the assassination of a refugee liaison when there was a coup to contend with. 4 hours later, on the other side of decontamination showers, after 1,000 tests to be sure they weren't bringing virus particles over the border and another long drive back to Durham, Lair walked side by side with Noam across the government complex courtyard. You did very well today, Lair said at last as they passed a manufactured waterfall on the stream, the crash of water loud enough to drown out their words by passerby. It won't take long now. That's good. We can't afford for Texas to get their hands on the vaccine. I know. Noam tugged at the hem of his sweater, self-conscious of the Beretta, now tucked into the back of his jeans, the holster safely sequestered in the QZ car. Carolina would be left defenseless. I know. Lair was still looking at him when Noam glanced up. Lair's expression was unreadable. I hope that you do, he said as they approached the atrium, the noise of the stream fading. I'm relying on you. When Noam returned to the barracks, heading past the empty common room and the generic framed wall art, which still struck him as bizarre, even though Noam had lived here over a year. Ames was waiting for him. She sat in the boys' bedroom on an empty bunk, a dark figure silhouetted against the window. Where were you? She kept her voice low, but Tay, who occupied the bed across from Noam, didn't stir. He always slept like the dead. Work? Ames had a bottle of vodka clutched between her knees. She held his gaze as she took a long swallow. No, you weren't. I went by the store and you weren't there. Not the store, the computer repair place. I thought you quit that job. Noam shrugged one shoulder. He pointed at the vodka. Gimme that. Ames rose to her feet. He couldn't make out the expression on her face, nor in this light, not until she'd already stepped closer and closer again, near enough he felt her breath on his skin. Her face was all tight lines, eyes narrowed and lips thin. She pressed the bottle into his hand. You don't need to adopt all of Dara's old habits. Dara didn't even like vodka. You know what I mean. He did, but he was never going to admit it. She left the bottle, although there wasn't much left. He stared down at the vodka, clear liquid sloshing around like the contents of Noam's stomach. Sickly, intoxicating. Noam poured the vodka down the sink. Better wasted than back in Ames' hands. She'd been drinking as much as Dara these days. Noam could count on one hand probably the number of times he'd seen her sober since her father had been murdered. Murdered by Dara. Although that seemed like the kind of detail Ames didn't need to know. What good would it do her now? Even though Noam hadn't drunk any of the vodka himself, when he lay down, curled up in Dara's old bed under Dara's old blanket, the room tilted and swayed before stabilizing. Noam pressed his face into the pillow and breathed in his own humid air, eyes clenched tight shut. It had been 6 months. Dara was dead by now. Noam knew that. Still, the room rocked again, dizziness rippling in waves through Noam's mind, or maybe that was the effect of the sleeping pills. When he closed his eyes lately, too often it was to see Dara's face. The way he'd looked when Noam put him in that car and sent him over the border into the QZ. The way he'd grasped at gnomes during the coup before Lair's soldiers dragged him away. The way his body would have decayed out there in the forest, rotting into the magic-infested soil until only his bones remained. One of these days, Gnome would be out there on a mission with Lair, and they'd find Dara's skull, half buried in a tangled root system. No, don't think about that. Gnome turned away from the bones. He'd imagined instead that he was on a small boat with Dara out in the middle of a vast and empty sea, dark and lifeless below them as above. It was snowing. The white flakes glittered in Dara's hair and melted before they could touch the surface of the ocean. Dara's fingertips, where they brushed Gnome's hand, were cold. Gnome watched him, the silence of his mouth and unreadable eyes, until Dara went blurry, the whole scene tilting sideways and smearing out of sight. After that, the night was dreamless. And that is the first chapter of Electric Heir by Victoria Lee, and it's a sequel. Let me know in the comments if that first chapter grabbed you. I felt like they didn't have the conversation parts in quotes. And they did. But they didn't, it wasn't always obvious to me, like, who was talking. And if it seemed like some of my voices were kind of weird, because I just started the first chapter. And like I said, when Lair's talking, or Michael, or Gnome, or Ames, I didn't know who was talking because it wasn't obvious every time. Sometimes it was. I would kind of give this first chapter kind of average as far as, like, did it pull me in? Was I excited? Do I want to need more? Or do I want to know more? Not bad. Believe me, I've had other stuff that's really bad that I don't feature on this channel or other channels that I've done. So pretty good. And this is from Skyscape. And it's available now on Amazon. Thank you, and until our next book, you guys take care and have a good day.